All right, thank you all for joining. It is 6 o'clock. We'll get started. We are the Nevada Department of Wildlife, and we're joined by Lake Mead Park Service, Julian Renner, who specializes in aquatic invasive species. So she'll introduce herself when she presents. This is a family program and is rated PG. No bad language or inappropriate behavior will be tolerated. If there's any bad questions, we'll have to kick you out. All questions, we request you to use the Q&A box, and then also we'll open up the chat box for some general questions throughout. And your camera is off and you're automatically muted since it is a webinar. And also we are recording it, so this will be on our YouTube and Nevada Department of Wildlife YouTube channel under webinars playlist. And it takes about a week or two. So tonight we're going to talk about some of the waters in the area, give you some background information on aquatic invasive species. Then we'll go all over Lake Mead. We'll go over some endemic species that have had some hard times with invasives and what you can do. Everybody can help. And then we'll answer some more questions. So there are natural springs all over Nevada. That's one of the amazing things about our desert is this is an example of a hot spring on the right here. And they just pop up all over the desert. You can even see some of the mountain ranges. Spring Mountain is named because there's so many natural springs, and that's how our wildlife survives, between that and the water in the plants. Over here is Lake Mead, all of this section along the Arizona border, and then all the way up to the Utah border here. So we will focus more on Southern Nevada since we're talking with Lake Mead. So what is an invasive? It's any non-native plant, animal, or other organism that did not originally belong to that area. They can also more talking. Sorry, too many windows open. So invasive species can, there we go, develop widespread populations with little that can stop them. They are animals that adapt very well to their environment. They also have negative impacts on the environment and cause problems to native populations. So invasives originally develop in their native environment, and that is the environment that they're used to surviving in. And when they get to a new environment, they typically are very different, but they are really well at adapting. And then they become predators that can keep the population in check or at a healthy level. They have a one-up on the species that's native to the area in that environment and can easily outcompete the native species for basic survival needs such as food, water, and shelter. It's important to remember that some of these native species are also endemic, meaning that they only live in that area and might already be struggling to survive or might be in danger. So one of the things we're really working on is the release of aquarium fish. They're not supposed to be outside of their tank in your home. There's also an aquarium trade, and people buy these awesome rare species but don't realize what goes into caring for them, and then they end up getting released into an environment that they have no right being in. One of our early pictures in the PowerPoint was actually of Roger Springs, and that is one of those waters, which is part of Lake Mead, and it is pretty much all aquarium fish now. So what happens when you dump that aquarium fish? It affects the native species and the habitat. A big one is also red-eared sliders. So they do have a native range, not out here, unfortunately, but we do see them at many of our urban parks and ponds and out at Lake Mead sometimes too. They are actually considered one of the world's 100 invasive species, and we're going to go into how long they can live. It's pretty amazing. Unfortunately, red-eared sliders occupy a variety of natural freshwater habitats, even wild streams, rivers, ponds, lakes. You'd think that they'd be more native to swamps or marshes. They can also be found in man-made habitats, so they're out at the wash, the canals, and our city parks. The red-eared sliders are often found in close proximity to urban areas because they are unfortunately released as a pet. So pet releases accidentally are released into the wild, or they're really good at escaping. So the impact from red-eared sliders to the native species is the food and the habitat. The sliders compete with Western pond turtles and actually eat their food, and then they eat their eggs and also take up their basking sites. So unfortunately, invasive species can travel on our equipment. So as we're out fishing, which is what I like to teach, little snails, little fish can even hide in some of these bulges on the pop-up or on a kayak or a canoe. Anything that holds water or isn't dried before it leaves an area can transport the species. So they transport and they can infect the new area. Felt on waders is actually outlawed in some areas because they're the perfect transport for little organisms and then easily transferred to a new body of water. So they've actually outlawed it in Yellowstone along some of those amazing rainbow trout fisheries. Recreationalists could knowingly be transferring snails and unknowingly, be transferring snails and other invaders to the new body of water. So we do recommend clean, drain, and dry all your equipment before you leave. And Julianne will go into more detail on that. So this is that part I was talking about with the red-eared sliders. Too far. So here we go, some crayfish facts. So there are multiple species, unfortunately, and none of them are native to our area. People accidentally release them as a bait, or they have them as a pet and then accidentally release them into the wild. So crayfish actually inhabit lakes, streams, ponds, and prefer areas like rocks, under logs, and other debris. The substrate at the bottom of these waters can be clay, silt, sand, gravel, and rock. And what is unfortunately really amazing about them is they can live in a dried up environment as long as there's moisture in the mud. They actually, because they bury themselves, they can survive up to a year. So sometimes they've had to do some reclamation projects and rotenone an area, and they still can survive underneath the rotenone treatment in the mud. So another impact, so you don't need a male and a female crayfish to begin the new population. Uh, a crayfish basically eats everything. They feed on aquatic plants, invertebrates, fish, eggs, small fish, and even dead or decaying plants and animals. And they are especially known for the deconstruction of some native species like crop poolfish. I think Michelle's going to finish that up with some at the end as well. So one more thing we want to be careful of. Oh, and sorry, on this picture of this native water, it also, I think, I'm sorry. Invasive species have a negative impact on the environment because they outcompete and they prey on the native species. So they may not have a natural predator in their environment, and then they end up outcompeting for the food, light, prey, and habitat. There we go. So finding their way into America's rivers and lakes, the Asian carp have unfortunately taken over some of these rivers. So luckily we haven't had any of these yet. You would definitely notice them just by being near the water. They freak out by the motion in the water and jump out. There's a lot of injuries due to these species. This is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service doing a survey, and they electroshock the area and try to catch as many as possible to take out of the rivers. It's a big problem in the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. So we do everything possible not to have a species like this in Lake Mead or Colorado River. All right, so now on to Julianne.
Hello. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Let's see here. All right, can you see that, Abby? All good? Okay, great. Well, thank you guys all for attending tonight. Like Abby said, my name is Julianne Renner. I work for the National Park Service at Lake Mead National Recreation Area. I am the Aquatic Invasive Species Interpretive Ranger, which is kind of just a long-winded way to say that I help educate the public about aquatic invasive species. And so I just wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about aquatic invasive species and specifically what we have going on here at Lake Mead. So just a quick overview of Lake Mead National Recreation Area. Hopefully you've been, and if not, maybe this will encourage you to visit. But Lake Mead is a national park unit. It's pretty large. It's 1.5 million acres of land and water. It borders 2 states, Nevada and Arizona, and there are 2 different reservoirs in the lake itself. There's the Lake Mead Reservoir, which is the northern reservoir, and then there's the Lake Mojave Reservoir, which is more south. We have quite a few visitors, and we have over 8 million visitors per year, which is really awesome. We had to shut down this month because of the pandemic on the Nevada side, but I think even still, we had the same numbers, even if we hadn't shut down for a month. So it just goes to show how important it is to be able to get outside these days for your physical and mental health. And we're really happy to have people being able to recreate at Lake Mead during this time. And we support 4,200 local jobs and have a $336 million economic impact. And then you can see the map on the right side of your screen there. All the surrounding cities. We have a couple different basins, especially in the northern area: Boulder Basin, Virgin Basin, Temple Basin, and Gregg Basin. And I might mention those a little bit later in the presentation. So I'm here to talk about aquatic invasive species. Abby touched on them briefly, but what are they? It's any non-native plant or animal or organism that's not native to an area and causes environmental or economic harm or harm to human health. So some prime examples of aquatic invasive species. This is a Hydrilla. It's a aquatic weed that I'll talk a little bit about later, but it's a good example of an aquatic invasive species. We have crayfish. Abby touched on those. We have Asian carp. I like to call them the flying fish. Abby also touched on those. Just some kind of prime examples of aquatic invasive species, ones that you might have heard of outside of Lake Mead. But a lot of times when we talk about aquatic invasive species, especially for me as an employee at Lake Mead, we do talk about quagga mussels. And I know this is kind of like it's kind of an aggressive graphic, infestation, the quagga mussel, but, and then there's a picture of something covered in quagga mussels, but I like to show this just to, set the reality of quagga mussels and the gravity of the situation and why it is something important to talk about. So I'm going to spend the next couple slides just focusing on quagga mussels. And how did they get here? We do have quagga mussels at Lake Mead. They were first detected at Lake Mead in 2007. And they're native to Eastern Europe. So what we think happened, or well, really what we know happened, is these large ships came from Eastern Europe across the Atlantic and entered the United States through our man-made canal system and into the Great Lakes. You can see in that photo of one of the ships, you see water coming out of the side, and that is water coming out of the ballast tanks of the ships. So quagga mussels were attached to ships and inside the water of these big ships that came across the Atlantic into the Great Lakes, and then they released that ballast water into the Great Lakes, thus releasing quagga mussels and other invasive species into the Great Lakes. And then slowly, as recreational boaters used the Great Lakes and then went to other bodies of water, quagga mussels slowly started to spread in the US. What's kind of important to note about quagga mussels in Lake Mead, again, they were first detected in 2007. Unfortunately for Lake Mead, we were the first body of water in the West to detect quagga mussels. So we were the first ones to really get a hit of quagga mussels, and then they've slowly kind of spread more in the West. It used to be kind of an Eastern problem in the 80s and 90s, but now it's becoming a Western problem as well. So quickly about the biology of quagga mussels, because I do think it's important to understand how they spread. You will look at the right side of your screen. You'll see that green image. It's a photo of a quagga mussel veliger, which is the microscopic young of quagga mussels. So you can't see it. It's free floating in the water. So these guys are important to note about the spread because you don't just see mussels attached to the outsides of boats or anchors or rocks or any of that. They can also spread because they have microscopic young that we can't see. So anything that holds water that comes from a body of water with quagga mussels can have these microscopic veligers in that water and thus can spread it without us knowing. And then if you look on the left side of the screen, you'll see an adult quagga mussel. And something important to note is at the top of that quagga mussel, it kind of looks like a bed head, like, somebody just woke up in the morning. Those little hairs are called byssal threads. And byssal threads are how quagga mussels attach to things. So freshwater mussels don't really have byssal threads. They don't attach to things, but quagga mussels do. And you can see kind of like the spots at the edge on the end of the byssal threads. That's called a byssus or a foot. And that secretes the mucus that helps them stick to things. So it's another part of quagga mussels and why they spread so easily, because they have the byssal threads that can attach to things. So what are some problems that quagga mussels cause? If you're familiar with them, you probably have seen examples like this, but you can see kind of the progression of quagga mussels attaching to a pipe submerged in Lake Mead. The end one, it was submerged for 6 months, and you can see that pipe is pretty much rendered useless at that point with that many quagga mussels attached to them. This is a picture of a boat motor covered in quagga mussels. So if you do have a boat in the water for months or even years at a time, quagga mussels will attach to that, and it takes a lot of work to clean it off and get it new again. And then another important factor to consider with quagga mussels are dams. And we, of course, have 2 dams within Lake Mead. There's the Hoover Dam up on Lake Mead, and there's Davis Dam down on Lake Mojave. And this is a photo of the Davis Dam penstock gate in 2007. And it's just covered with quagga mussels. And then here's another photo of an intake pipe. And it's also an intake pipe of the Davis Dam, and again, covered in quagga mussels. And this was in 2007. So times have changed, and we have really learned how to deal with quagga mussels and how to do preventative maintenance, but it is definitely still a factor that we have to deal with in our damming system. And of course, it provides power and electricity to over 2 million people in the Las Vegas Valley. So it is a pretty big deal. And if we think of the Pacific Northwest, especially, that doesn't have any lakes infested with quagga mussels, and how much of those cities and those states rely on power and electricity from dams, it would be devastating for quagga mussels to get to the Pacific Northwest and have to deal with this in their dam systems. So we touched on quagga mussels, but there are, of course, invasive species outside of quagga mussels, and I want to talk about a couple that I think would be of interest to you if you are visiting Lake Mead. Some of them are at Lake Mead, some of them are not, but just ones to keep an eye out for sure. So this is tilapia. There's actually a couple different species of tilapia on this slide. On the left side, we have blue tilapia, which has been spotted at several different basins within Lake Mead, so Boulder Basin, I believe, and Virgin Basin. We have the spotted tilapia, which is the top right photo. That one has been spotted at Rogers Spring in Lake Mead. Abby mentioned that place before. It is where a lot of fish do get dumped. And so spotted tilapia has been seen at Rogers Spring. And then the bottom right photo is red belly tilapia. And that one we actually don't have at Lake Mead, but is one to keep an eye out for. It has been located in California and Arizona. So definitely one we don't want want to keep an eye out for. Tilapia caused several different kinds of problems. They were actually originally introduced, they were intentionally stocked to be a biocontrol for mosquitoes and other aquatic weeds. But of course, unfortunately, when we do introduce new species to take care of problems, a lot of times that new species becomes an even bigger problem. And that's kind of what we've seen with tilapia. But I wanted to highlight the species because, of course, you can fish for tilapia and you can catch tilapia. And it's a great way to go outside and do your favorite activity, fishing, catch a fish, and then get to fry it up at home and eat it. And you can eat a delicious meal and also be helping stop invasive species from invading an ecosystem. So it's a win-win for everybody. And then the next one I wanted to talk about is Hydrilla. I showed a photo of this earlier, but I wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about Hydrilla. It's an aquatic weed. You can see kind of the photos here on the left side. It is Hydrilla like covering the motor of a moat, or the motor of a boat, excuse me. And you can see it in the background too. It's just absolutely decimating the area. It forms in like these really big mats. So not only do boats get stuck going through it, but it's really gross to swim in. So recreation is negatively impacted. And then it, of course, negatively impacts the native species. It creates more shade than what's normal in that area, changes the oxygen levels of the water and the salinity. So, and really important species that we want to prevent from getting to Lake Mead. We don't have it, and we don't want to see any of these kind of mats in of all of our wonderful coves. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the New Zealand mud snail. Abby talked a little bit about some of these snail species that can get stuck in your gear, especially in your fishing gear. And New Zealand mud snail is definitely one that we are looking out for and talk about a lot. You can see on the screen, they are small, but they are mighty. These guys, in one scientific study, they were found to form in densities of 800,000 individuals per meter squared. So they can form in really intense populations and then totally decimate native invertebrates, and again, change the ecosystem and outcompete native species. Also, because they are so small, they're super easy to transport. So if you're looking, if you're wearing your waders and you're going fishing, they can be stuck on the bottom in mud, or if any mud is stuck to your boat. They're hard to tell, or they're hard to see, and it's hard to tell what they are. So they're pretty easy to transport. So after we talked a little bit about what invasive species we have, we want to talk about how do we prevent their spread. And it's pretty simple, really. And it mostly just involves, if you are recreating on the water, to clean, drain, and dry any gear that you have or anything that really entered the water. So if we talk about boats first, cleaning, so making sure there are no plants, mud, or animals on the outside of your boat. Draining, so anything that holds water, like your live wells, your bilges, make sure to drain them of their water. And then drying, so making sure after they're drained, there's no like little puddles left over, because even in those little puddles, for example, quagga mussel villagers can survive for days at a time. So making sure all your gear is dried as well. And this applies to not just boats with motors, but kayaks, canoes, rafts, floaty tubes, anything that can hold water can transport invasive species. And it's not just boaters, it's also fishermen, unfortunately. So we want to make sure for your fishing gear, you're checking your waders at the bottom of them, making sure there's no mud. You're checking your nets, your clothing, even your fishing rod and reel can transport invasive species. And it's also important to be responsible with your bait. So make sure that you're using the approved bait for that area and never releasing live bait back into the water if you got it from somewhere else. So at the end of my presentations, I always like to ask the question, so what? Ideally, you walk away from these presentations and you understand like why this matters, but at the end of the day, so what? Like, why do we care about invasive species? Well, we care because of all of these photos on this screen. We care about future generations being able to use Lake Mead and recreate at Lake Mead and do the same things that we have loved to do at Lake Mead. We care because we have the Hoover Dam on Lake Mead, and that supplies power and energy to millions of people. We care because we want to protect our native species. The fish on the screen is a razorback sucker, which is an endangered fish we have here at Lake Mead. And we care because we want to recreate on the water. We want to take our boats out and water ski and wakeboard and not have to scrape quagga mussels off of our boats. The mission of the National Park Service is to preserve and protect unimpaired the natural and cultural resources for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. So that should always answer our so what question. Why do we care about aquatic invasive species? Because we want to make sure that people can enjoy Lake Mead exactly the way that we've been able to enjoy it for this generation and future generations. And that's why I think aquatic invasive species are important. And that's the end of my presentation. I can answer questions. Somebody says hello, hello. Thank you. I don't think I see any questions yet. Oh, wait, sorry. What is the most dangerous of the invasive species you described? Good question. I mean, I would say quagga mussels, but obviously I talked a lot about quagga mussels, and we kind of know that they are a problem species. But I think New Zealand mud snails are a really interesting one, and something that is important to keep an eye out for, because they are so small, and it's difficult to monitor them because we can't see them, and then they're spreading all over the place. It's just even more difficult to monitor. So I wouldn't necessarily say they're dangerous. You know, they're not going to bite anybody. But New Zealand mud snails are definitely one, I think, that can be really harmful to the ecosystem, but can go unnoticed. Is the New Zealand mud snail, somebody asked, is the New Zealand mud snail upriver from Lake Mead? That is a good question. I believe, I'll have to double check, but I believe they have been found like up in the Grand Canyon, so upriver from us. So it is definitely something that it's difficult. Obviously, we have a dam in between us, but also if there's an invasive species that's upriver from us, naturally some of that water is going to flow down, and we might just get it because it's upriver. So I believe there are New Zealand mud snails upriver, like in the Grand Canyon. And then another question. Michelle, do you need to go? Should I save some of these questions for later?
You can go ahead and answer the questions that you have now, and then we'll also have time for you to answer more questions, or if anyone else thinks of questions along the way, we'll also answer those at the end.
Okay, perfect. I have another question. It says, what approach are you guys currently using to try and eradicate quaggas? Very good question. So the thing with quagga mussels is it's difficult to eradicate them. For the most part, no one has found any good ways to like eradicate the species from a lake. There are millions of quagga mussels on the bottom of the lake in the mud. There's millions of veligers free floating in the water. So there's nothing we can really do at this point to fully eradicate any of the species. And so our main focus right now is preventing them from spreading to other lakes. That's the biggest thing. We want to make sure other lakes do not get quagga mussels. And the thing with Lake Mead also is there have been studies to try and eradicate quagga mussels. There's been reservoirs that have been completely drained and dry to eradicate quagga mussels, and then they bring the water back and quagga mussels came back. And Lake Mead is massive. So there's no way we can drain Lake Mead or put anything in it to try and kill quagga mussels. It's just not really going to work. Let's see. I have one more question, or a couple more. Do you think climate change has a great contribution to the spread of these invasive species other than the human being's impact? It's definitely possible. I mean, as we see like changing temperatures, you know, species may be moving to accommodate to those certain temperatures and water temperatures and air temperatures. I can't say like exactly if there are like specific species that have come in this area because of climate change, but it definitely is a factor to consider. Why are the tilapias a problem to lakes? Okay, why are the tilapias a problem for our lakes? Good question. So tilapia, again, just kind of if we're talking about invasive species, they outcompete our native species. They are known for eating fish eggs. They're voracious eaters, and then they also do have impacts on the oxygen levels in lakes and the salinity in lakes as well. So they just are good at outcompeting for our native fish and even for our sport fish in the lake. I think that's all of my questions for now.
That's awesome. Thank you.
If there are more, I can answer them.
I'll leave you to answer those, and we'll start talking about the relic leopard frog, which are just north of Lake Mead. They're technically the north end of Lake Mead. They feed in with the Virgin River, which is near the Overton Arm and the Overton Basin of Lake Mead. At one time, we thought they were extinct, but they were rediscovered in 1991. And so through this study, we did find out that they are considered vulnerable, not endangered or extinct, thank goodness. Relic leopard frog were known to occur in 24 sites in Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, so where the 3 states meet there. In the 1990s, there were only 7 native population sites and only 5 now, which still remain out of the 24 original sites. So how did this happen? So mainly habitat changes. So when the dam happened, it kind of affected the water development, and then also land, so agriculture and urban development in those areas. Relic leopard frog also suffered from low genetic variations. And because of their size and the introduction of larger frogs, such as bullfrogs, which eat their eggs, eat them when they're small, all of those things. And then also invasive plants and burrows have also pushed them out of their natural environments. So just like we've seen wild cattle and burrows, and they stomp the grounds that they're in. And then also exotic fish have been released into those areas, and crayfish, because they're a bottom feeder, eat the eggs of them. We do have other presentations on how some efforts have been done to preserve the eggs so that they're not on the bottom where crayfish and other bottom feeding fish can get to their eggs, which have helped a lot of their population sizes. And because of their dangerously low population and multiple threats, we monitor them very regularly. And just while we're talking about all of this, and before Michelle gets into how you can help, by keeping these species alive, you're protecting the ecosystem. You're protecting your backyard. And these cute little faces.
Thank you, Abby. So what we want to do is when we're about to get a new pet, we always want to plan for the future because pets are a long-term investment. They live for a pretty long time. We can see here that the average lifespan of a healthy goldfish is 10 years, while a parrot can live up to 50 years. And the world record-breaking goldfish actually died at the age of 43 years old. So they're more than just a fun gift. They are another being that we have to take care of, so it's good to prepare for instances like vet appointments, emergency care, and possible health conditions. And also properly researching what the needs of our future pet are, like the best foods for its diet, the kind of environment we want to mimic for it to live comfortably, those kind of things. And we also want to analyze if the pet is a good fit for our lifestyle and ensure that we can be good pet parents and if it's the right time and place for us to adopt a new pet. So this goldfish was probably just a few inches long when it was released into this pond, but it grew to be the size of a football. And they can have really big impacts on a habitat. They can harm water quality, introduce disease, disturb ecosystems, and threaten native species populations. So what we want to do is ask for help when we are buying a new fish friend. It's really important to do your research and know what you're getting into. And the employees at fish and pet shops will help you make sure that you can properly take care of your fish and everything you need for it. So most pets released into the wild don't survive, and many suffer before they die. Pets are usually unable to find food or shelter in the wild, and they're often an easy meal for another animal. And if it does manage to survive, your pet becomes an invasive species that native wildlife may not have the defenses to compete against. Invasive species, like we've learned, cause harm to the environment and the economy. So you can help by supporting Don't Ditch a Fish and Don't Let It Loose pet shops. And in the case that you need to give up your pet, you can always give these rehoming options a try. You can bring them back to pet shops. Sometimes they may be able to pay you for your pet, or you can donate it or resell or regift to places like offices, schools, and clubs. And if needed, a vet may be able to help you humanely euthanize the animal. So we are in the process of rolling out a program called Don't Ditch a Fish, and ultimately the goal of this plan is to stop the illegal introduction of non-native aquarium fish and other invasive species in Nevada waters where endemic species can be found, basically to get people to stop ditching their fish. The purpose of it is to educate pet owners on why they shouldn't try to set their pets free when they don't want them anymore, because as we've learned, they can really hurt our ecosystems and fragile habitats. It's very costly to try to restore those environments, and most of the time, like Julian mentioned, they've only been really successful at getting rid of those invasive species when you completely drain a lake, leave it be for an extended period of time, and then try to start over. And on top of that, ditching your fish or other pet, for that matter, is illegal. So the main thing to take away from this program is to not release your aquatic pets or plants into the wild. Don't Let It Loose is another great program that's similar to Don't Ditch a Fish, and most of Nevada's independent pet stores are part of the Don't Let It Loose community. They have resources too for other animals like birds, reptiles, amphibians, and exotic pets. And their website here at the bottom lists pet shops around Nevada and all throughout the United States, other states that are part of the program, and they give those resources for Don't Let It Loose communities. So these are some stores that support those returns, and when purchasing a fish from these stores, they'll provide information on the Don't Let It Loose program and why it's important to not release your fish into the wild. And if you decide that you no longer want your pet, most of these shops will be able to take your fish in for you, and in the case that they're unable to do so, they'll always provide you with advice on other options. And a big way to help is to spread the knowledge that you've learned. If anyone you know is planning on getting a fish or getting rid of a fish for that matter, let them know it's illegal to try to set it free and offer some suggestions on where to purchase one and what to do if they don't end up wanting it anymore.
All right, thank you, Michelle. So as you leave, there is a survey to please fill out. Let us know how you'd like the program tonight, what you'd like to see more of. And we do have more programming all next week. It's National Invasive Species Awareness Week, and we've also named it Urban Wildlife Week. They kind of go hand in hand, unfortunately. And that brings us to the question that got brought up in our Q&A, and I really like it for multiple reasons. So what the question is, why are there not more turtles in the natural spring that popped in the Henderson area of Stephanie and Arroyo Grande? So I'm pretty sure that's the one that's also called Railroad Pond and or Cornerstone Park. And that technically is a natural spring, but it's because of rainwater. So it does feed into the wash. So it's a good thing that there's not more turtles. The turtles that are there are released by humans, by pets. There are some fish in there from the wash. Some bass have actually gone upstream, upstream, sorry, from the wetlands. There's a lot of carp in there and a lot of mosquito fish. Okay, perfect. And so yeah, Cornerstone Park is literally, they just pulled it up, just like we dammed up Lake Mead to create a larger body of water. Cornerstone was created the same way. And so after so much runoff, it's actually just created a pool of water. And also we don't want too much wildlife to stay there. So we do have some great webinars on not feeding wildlife. And I have seen that the geese are pretty numerous at that park. We don't want them to stay there and eat there too long because the water is runoff and it's actually also contaminated from the Pepcon blast back in the 90s, late 80s, 90s. I was very little when that happened here. So don't touch the water and we don't want to fish in the water, unfortunately. We do have our emails here, and I'm sorry, Michelle, I have yours on the updated presentation, but I sent you it before I finalized it. But you can email us with any of your questions, and awesome to see more questions. I'll let Julianne maybe take the next one.
Okay, let's see. Oh, okay. So this question says, I also live in an area where invasive species are a problem. So are there any programs out here designed to train the public in spotting these invasive species and reporting them? Do we have anything like that for Lake Mead? That's a fantastic question. And I'm actually working right now to design a citizen science program. So ideally, in the next year or so, we are gonna have an education tool for people who want to be a citizen science, and it'll be there to help us identify known invasive species that we have at Lake Mead and to monitor to see if we find any new invasive species at Lake Mead. So we'll have like an online class that you can take so you can identify, learn how to identify invasive species, and then you can go out into the park and on the lake and monitor certain areas to keep an eye out for those specific species. If you're looking to join, we don't have anything concrete yet, but we're hoping to soon. Keep an eye out on like the Lake Mead Facebook page. We'll be doing stuff on iNaturalist as well. And then you can take a free class that will help you identify invasive species and get you out on the water and be able to help us out, which is really awesome.
And to add on to that, if you do see someone releasing something into the water, if you're not sure, but you can get a picture, let us know. We do have NDOW tip line. It's NDOW 411. And it's an app. You just download it, especially if you're out and about a lot. We can forward it to Lake Mead Rangers. We can forward it to local metropolitan police department if it becomes a matter like that. But please let us know if you see anything weird. We're here to help and protect our wildlife. So then there was one more question in the chat on Lake Erie and what they have done to inhibit quagga mussels.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. I started typing out an answer, but I will happily answer that one live. And I think that's a good question. I don't know any specifics for Lake Erie, but I can answer to the Great Lakes region, and they have been doing, they're a prime example for us in educating and eradicating quagga mussels, because they've been doing it for much longer than we have. They've been, quagga mussels arrived in the Great Lakes in the 1980s, so they've had to deal with this problem since the 80s. So one really important thing that the Great Lakes do is they have extensive education programs about quagga mussels and zebra mussels and other invasive species. They do similar programs that NDOW has at Lake Mead, which is boat washing. They have people out on the lawn tramps talking to every boater as they are coming in and out. So they have extensive education, talking to people about how to properly clean, drain, dry, why we don't want any of these species to spread to other bodies of water. In a boat washing program is also super important. As far as actually trying to get rid of quagga mussels, I think it's similar to Lake Mead in that, at the Great Lakes, there's so much water. It's really impossible to fully eradicate mussels from that body of water, but they do a lot of scientific studies in the Great Lakes as well that help us learn about their behavior and how they do impact ecosystems.
Well, thank you, ladies, for joining me tonight. If there are any more questions, please let us know. We have our email addresses too if you think of something later on. And thank you to all of you for watching along with us today.